One may ask, why do we need these workplace exposure limits? The answer is, for workplace. Many people are exposed to a variety of substances at work. These may have harmful effects on health from hazardous substances. These include dust, fumes, chemicals, vapors, mists, nanotechnology, gases, biological agents, and germs that cause disease. If exposure to a hazardous substance is not properly controlled, it may cause ill health in a number of ways. The substance may cause harm by 1. Too much being taken into the body through breathing, 2. Being swallowed, 3. Acting directly on the body at the point of contact, example the skin, or being absorbed through the skin. Some illnesses caused by exposure to hazardous substances in the workplace may not appear until a long time after the first exposure. Therefore, it is important to know in advance. 1. What are the hazards exposed at specific workplace? And 2. What is the safe limit of exposure to those hazards? Workplace exposure limits are derived from some prejudged criteria expressed in the form of uncertainty factors. These may differ for non-carcinogens and non-asthmagens when compared to carcinogens and asthmagens. Let's discuss the 4 uncertainty criteria for non-carcinogens and non-asthmagens and 2 uncertainty criteria for carcinogens. For non-carcinogens and non-asthmagens, uncertainty criteria include 1. Margin of exposure, MOE, 2. Benchmark dose, BMD, 3. No observed adverse effect level, NOAEL, and 4. Derived no effect level, DNEL. Margin of exposure is a defined level below which the exposure is acceptable on risk-benefit grounds. Benchmark dose produces a predetermined change in response rate of an adverse effect. No observed adverse effect level is a prejudged criteria of acceptability to yield a reference dose. Derived no effect level is considered the maximum acceptable exposure level. For carcinogens and asthmagens, uncertainty factors include 1. Derived minimal effect level, DMEL, and 2. As low as reasonably practicable, ALARP. Derived minimal effect level is the maximum effect deemed tolerable. It is used to suggest that the substance is banned or tightly controlled. It is presumed that a no observed adverse effect level cannot be defined, and thus an acceptable level of exposure cannot be identified. As low as is reasonably practicable, ALARP, is the concept that suggests the use of the substance is only allowed with a continuing duty to reduce exposure. As low as is reasonably practicable, below the level of the workplace exposure limit, using the hierarchy of exposure control. COSH uses 2 types of occupational exposure limits. 1. The Occupational Exposure Standard, OES, and 2. The Maximum Exposure Limit, MEL. Both are expressed as airborne concentrations averaged over a period, either a long-term exposure limit over 8-hour time-weighted average, or a short-term exposure limit over 15-minute reference period. Let's compare the occupational exposure standards and maximum exposure limits in terms of 1. Indicative criteria, 2. Nature of substances, 3. Requirements for employers for these limits, and 4. Examples where OES and MEL are applicable. The occupational exposure standard is used where a safe concentration of a substance can be identified with reasonable certainty, and the substance does not have serious health implications to worker. These generally includes non-carcinogens, non-asthmagens and non-genotoxics. On the other hand, the maximum exposure limit is used where a safe concentration of a substance cannot be identified, and the chemical has serious health implications for workers. These generally includes carcinogens, asthmagens, and genotoxics. Responsibility of the employers also varies based on the chemicals which require occupational exposure standards or maximum exposure limits. For occupational exposure standard, the exposure may exceed the suggested limit provided steps are taken to meet it as soon as reasonably practicable. Employers are required to meet the limit, but there is no requirement to go below it. On the other hand, for maximum exposure limit, exposure should be reduced so far as is reasonably practicable, as well as below the MEL. Examples of occupational exposure standard include various metal fumes, for example iron oxide, manganese, chromium, as these have defined exposure limits. On the other hand, example of maximum exposure limit may include benzene, where no WEL is set, and advised to employers is to keep exposure as low as is reasonably practicable.